Dear guests, welcome all. Today I have the honor of introducing Eric Owen Moss to you. He's going to give a lecture which has an interesting title, The Day the Sun Stood Still. Eric Owen Moss, who accepted to give an online lecture to our students at İstanbul Kültür University Faculty of Architecture, and other students in various universities in Turkey, and also many architects will be listening to him tonight. He's so famous and he has so brilliant ideas in architecture that everybody is interested in this lecture. The world is going through difficult days, and I hope that through this lecture, Eric Owen Moss will initiate motivation and encouragement to our students who are continuing their education online at present, and also to all the different parties that are listening right now. I would like to give a short introduction of Mr. Eric Owen Moss, first in English and a short summary in Turkish. This is his CV. Eric Owen Moss received a Bachelor of Arts from the University of California at Los Angeles and holds a master's degrees in architecture both from the University of California at Berkeley College of Environmental Design and Harvard University's Graduate School of Design. Eric Owen Moss Architects was founded in 1973. The Culver City-based office has completed projects in the United States and around the world. There are 22 published monographs on the work of the office, and the projects have garnered over 140 local, national, and international design awards. Moss has received numerous prestigious honors, such as Academy Award in Architecture from the American Academy of Arts and Letters, AIA LA Gold Medal, Art Pavil Award in Guadalajara, and also he has been listed in Time magazine as Vespertine as one of the world's greatest places to visit in 2018. Moss has held teaching positions at major universities around the world, including Harvard, Yale, Columbia, and also University of Applied Arts in Vienna. He has been a long-time professor at the Southern California Institute of Architecture, and served as its director from 2002 to 2015. He received the Most Admired Educator Award from the Design Futures Council in 2013 and the AIA LA Educator of the Year in 2006. Now, a short introduction in Turkish. Türk öğrencilerimiz için kısaca açıklıyorum. Eric Owen Moss lisans eğitimini Los Angeles'taki Kaliforniya Üniversitesi'nde tamamlamış. Daha sonra hem Berkeley'deki Kaliforniya Üniversitesi Çevre Tasarım Okulu'nda hem de Harvard Üniversitesi Lisansüstü Tasarım Okulu'nda mimarlık üzerine yüksek lisans eğitimi almıştır. Ofisini 1973 yılında kurmuştur. Ofisin çalışmaları üzerine 22 değişik monografi vardır ve 140'ın üzerinde yerel, ulusal ve uluslararası tasarım ödülü almıştır. Bu ödüller posterimizde de yer almaktadır. Moss, dünyanın farklı ülkelerinde Harvard, Yale, Columbia, Viyana Uygulamalı Sanatlar Üniversitesi'nde akademisyenlik yapmıştır. Güney Kaliforniya Mimarlık Enstitüsü'nde uzun süredir profesörlük yapmaktadır ve 2002-2015 yılları arasında da yönetici olmuştur. Kendisi sadece tasarımlarıyla değil, aynı zamanda eğitimci olarak da ödüller kazanmıştır. Okay, now I will leave the floor to Mr. Eric Owen Moss, and I would like to say hello to Eric, and I would like to leave the floor to him. Thank you, Eric, again.
If I don't sit right in the middle, check this out. Well, it's very tiny.
Yeah, I think it'll speed up the slides.
But is it going to enlarge? Or what?
No, your slides will
Huh?
come. The slides will come.
Okay. Good evening and good morning. Thank you very much for the introduction. You mentioned optimism and you mentioned the world is in a difficult time. And if I have any particular motive in giving this talk, it would be to encourage students and architects alike. And in a longer perspective, the world has seen all sorts of adventures that go up and go down and go sideways. And architecture, I think, is a commentator on that. In a certain sense, from a distance, looking at architecture tells us who ruled, who was ruled, what the rules were, who objected, who protested, who went along. So we can read our history in the architecture we make over millennia, and certainly sitting on either side of the Bosphorus, looking east or looking west, we can see that history. You can see it out your window. So I think it's important that people who are listening understand that perspective, and architecture can add to that commentary. And the question is, how do you add to it? What do we do? What do we make? Why do we do it? Architecture, as I said, talks to the world about itself. That's one aspect. It also is solitary, it's private, it's personal. And in a way, in doing the work that we do, and I say we, I'm also talking to myself, along with talking to you and to a few colleagues. Can I get the first? Can you put up the slides, please? What? So there was a mention of the title of the lecture, and of the many lectures that I've done over the years. Not many are in this form. Not many are remote. I have to say, parenthetically, I think that we shouldn't forget how important it is when we can do it again, that we gather together and talk to each other physically, in person. Remote lecturing, remote conferences, remote discussions with students are serviceable, they can work. But the personal intimacy of an exchange when we're all in the same room and all in the same venue is extremely critical, I think. It communicates something very different in terms of intensity, in terms of personality, in terms of emotion, in terms of conviction. A lot of those personal qualities are ameliorated, are mitigated, I think are compromised with the remote conversation. So it's something that is serviceable. We do it. We shouldn't complain about it. And we should work toward the day when we can go back and talk to each other and hold hands and so on. Let me say a word about the title of the lecture. Many cultures, I'm not a cultural anthropologist, I have no particular expertise in that endeavor. I have interests. And many cultures, East and West, have myths and tales and stories. And one of those stories has to do with a day when the earth and the sun didn't behave as they normally do. The sun broke the rules, and the earth wasn't very cooperative. I can't tell you if any of that is true. I certainly wasn't there, neither were you. But the stories always fascinated me because what was important, or what was my point, and the reason for using this as a title, is the rule was broken, or the exception was made, and it wasn't credible and it wasn't believable. And it astonishes us, and perhaps it suggests that what we need to do is to reconsider that maybe we don't know all there is to know. Maybe we don't understand how to do this work. Maybe there are other ways to see and think and understand and imagine. And a striking exception to the rule in architecture or in one's life might suggest, again, to everyone who inhabits a building or passes by a building or sees an image of a building on a screen or in a book or in a journal, that what you think you know might possibly be reconsidered and understood in a different way. Next, please. So this is from a ballet called Agon. Agon is a Greek word for competition. It's a competition between people. It's a competition within yourself. Watch the hand. So the hand that shakes, the hand that twitches, the hand that aspires to stability and can't quite be stable, the tension between the need to stabilize and the impossibility of stabilizing is what we're interested in. That quality, perhaps, is translatable formally, spatially, shape-wise in architecture. The shaking of the hand to stabilize the ballerina. Next, please. So my father was a writer, and when he wasn't writing, he used to make a list of words, synonyms, antonyms, homonyms, working on the tools. And when I was a young kid and I watched him do that, it stuck in my mind as a way of working on his craft. So years ago, we made our own list. So this is my list of possibilities. There's no program, there's no site, there's no scale, there's no budget, there's no client. There are just form and shape and order and organization. They're possibilities, they're ideas. This is architecture in a solitary sense. This is architecture in its purest sense. It has no obligations whatsoever. to anything except its own imagination of what it might be.
It might be
Do I go now?
They'll pull it back up on the side.
So I hit it. Whoa.
Go forward one. Try it now. Try the side button.
Okay, that's it. I hope the video worked. That's Philip Glass music in the background. That was my list. And this is a for instance, as an extension of that conversation, this is a for instance of two of those objects related to one another. Again, to begin with, no program, no scale, no site, no client, no budget. And what I thought I would do was show you briefly examples over the years of an extrapolation between these form, shape, space ideas and a series of actual projects and the translation of the ideogram or the diagram or the tiny model into a variety of possibilities. And I think the operational principle, and I'd like you to keep this in mind, the operational principle is for us, perhaps not for you, that we can put anything into anything. And by that I mean the configuration, the shape, the form, and the space is variable and can accommodate any number of diverse programs. So this is a for instance in Cairo. You can see what we've come to call the spiral applied here. So that's Cairo. It's a museum. This is Vienna. A few years later, we were invited to propose an open air market in the center of the city. Again, the spiral, the form changes, it becomes structural, it holds a canopy and a variety of uses. A market in Vienna. This is an invited competition in Almaty in Kazakhstan, and you can see the interrelationship now of the spiral, which doesn't hold a program within it, but supports a program above it. That's Almaty. This was one of the biennales in Venice a few years after Almaty. This is a relatively recent proposal. This is an invited competition in Moscow, in what they call New Moscow, and you can see the transformation of the spiral. It's become an orthogonal condition. And finally, in this series of examples, a gate to an office complex that we built recently in Los Angeles. So the variability and the versatility of those tools, the spiral, to accommodate any number of sizes, shapes, and uses is the point of this exercise. This is a house. This should be a video. See if we can make it work as a video. Hold on a second. Be right back. Entrada's not working. Video. Can we make it work?
We just did the first image on that. For the gift. It's just a single image.
You want me to just go ahead?
Yeah.
Skip it? Okay, this is a house, a relatively new project in Los Angeles. It's a video which, apologies all around, is not playing. It's for a prima ballerina and a football player, a quarterback. And it raises the question, it's a house, and it raises the question, what is a house? And the way that subject is addressed is to vary the form from bottom to top. So it's a smooth, continuous surface, but it behaves differently as it moves vertically and horizontally. And this gives you an idea of that as a worm's eye axonometric, so it exists in a certain circumstance in plan at the ground, and an entirely different circumstance as a line at the roof. And the building is a perpetual transition, a kind of kinetic building or a kinetic transition, which by analogy represents the prima ballerina as a prima ballerina and the quarterback as a quarterback. The way we did this was, and I think this probably couldn't have been done until the last 10 or 15 years. It's essentially a wood building, a stick building, and each stick in the building is different. I won't go through all the drawings in detail, but the brighter the color, the purple, the steeper the curve, so that each member of the structure of the construction is made differently. They're all milled. What is that?
Okay. Does that fix it for you? You able to see it?
Are they going to play the video?
You can go ahead. It's your webcam's not broadcasting.
No,
It's
not,
okay. Just keep going.
it's not moving.
Oh. Okay. Now the video's working.
Okay, we're back again live. This is the plan of the building at the foundation. These are the corners, and unusual as pieces of construction. If you look at the image, let me see if I can make this. So if you look at this condition at the top, which is approaching a right angle, and you look at it as it descends to the ground, it becomes a curve. So what we've done is to fabricate out of multiple pieces of lumber a corner which transitions from a right angle at the top to a curve at the bottom, which conveys that kinetic or change of form. This is another piece of the house, which is a theater, a presentation area, the same issues of assembling and milling the lumber. And the support for the cantilever, again, all the lumber is milled. Now we take a jump from Los Angeles to medieval Moscow and a brief look at a couple of projects there. The city of white and gold, and was once characterized as a riddle and a mystery wrapped in.
White City is about 698 miles away by
Can you
car.
get that? Another phone. Just flip it upside down. But there are two projects that I wanted to mention in the context of understanding the cultures that you participate in when you work in countries around the world. And whatever we think Russia is, and this is perhaps more a discourse for a political science class, there are inklings of openings or freedom from time to time. And into those inklings or into those cracks, we've moved once in the early 2000s when we won a competition for the Muryansky. And the cultural prize of the Russians, or at least one of them, is the Muryansky Ballet, which is housed in St. Petersburg. So this is a competition we won. And then a number of years later, relatively recently, we were invited to participate in a competition for a bank called Sberbank, which is the Russian National Bank. What was of particular interest about this, that highway or walkway or pedestrian route you're looking at in the orange color uses again the spiral tool, spatial tool, to organize it. It's now orthogonal, which means the corners are more right angles. And it was to be a space that produced exchange, cultural discourse, information, openness, all of that. That was the goal. This is in New Moscow. And the analogy would probably be something like Silicon Valley in America. So this is a perspective section through Sberbank. Can't get the damn thing to work.
Just drag it down. Click on an image. There you go.
So this is the executive zone. This is the Great Hall, information exchange, and this is a flexible working space. That thing's a pain in the neck. Another view of the executive zone. And the project in the landscape in New Moscow. This is the project I mentioned a moment ago in Kazakhstan. But the reason I show it and what's curious about it is the intersection, very large building, substantial program, retail, hotel, housing, office space, and a big public area. And the intersection of the spiral as it intersects with the red block or the program, and then the light shafts that intervene in the space. And this is the milling, for instance. And a drawing, what was particularly curious about this is Kazakhstan, as is Istanbul, and as is Los Angeles, a major earthquake area. And the pieces at grade, the white pieces that are perpendicular to the building, brace the spiral which runs in the opposite direction. The spiral moves, expands, and contracts, and seems to be a plausible device for dealing with seismic issues. And then an enormous public venue with the program above and on the perimeter, parking below, and then opening up to an even larger public venue called Republic Square in Almaty, Kazakhstan. This is a current project next to Lake Erhai, a very long, very thin lake in southwest China. And you can see that's the site overlooking the lake, a spectacular site. And one of the interesting questions I imagine, particularly to students, has something to do with how a project begins, how it originates, and what the origination diagram conceptual model suggests about the forecast for the project. So we developed this diagram, again, absent the program, working on a diagram that we thought would have multiple spatial and organizational possibilities. And that's followed by a series of sketches which begin to deal with the project, which has a large exhibit zone, a large lecture zone, an on-grade performance area, and then decks and rooftops for vistas over the lake. So this is the sequence. Let's see if I can get this. So this is an on-grade open-air theater. This is the beginning of the lecture space and more lecture space and the exhibition area. And then the final object, and you can see the two solid zones representing the two primary programmatic aspects of the project, and then the vertical component has to do with stairs and elevators and so on. I want to say a word or two about cities, urbanism, a major topic in the architectural and design discourse. And this is a sequence that I developed over the years, which runs in stages from left to right. So the piece on the left is the city of instinct. The piece in the middle is the city of method. And the piece on the right is the city of redundancy. So it runs in a sequence 1, 2, 3, left to right. And what it suggests is that initially, the opening strategic development of cities is relatively free of rules. And as time passes, the rules become the city of method. And you can see from the perimeter to the central area, as the grid comes to develop, and its rules and its regulations and its dimensional questions. And then on the right, the city, what we call the city of redundancy, where imagination has largely disappeared, but rules and regulations are what dominates the discourse. This is a project. I want to show you two projects, which are the two next two pieces of this discussion. One is in Nanjing, which we worked on for about 3 years with a client there. And the conception is to enlarge the city in an area which is about 25 kilometers by 25 kilometers, and it's a wetlands. And that was proposed to be done immediately, essentially all at once as an organizational strategy. And the second piece is an area in Los Angeles, also an urban discourse, which has been worked on over a period of about 25 years. So this Nanjing project is called the Nanjing Charter. Nanjing Charter in response to, and you may know of this and you may have studied it and you may not, the Athens Charter, which was produced by the CIAM about 100 years ago. and was a series of rules, regulations, strategies, and opportunities for making cities in the early, middle, and late 20th century. And it had enormous influence. It had rules about housing, it had rules about work, it had rules about recreational space, it had rules about transportation. And they were hard, fast regulations that presupposed a certain way of living in a city. And essentially, to keep the discussion relatively concise, what we've produced is more like an urban dictionary, a way of conceptualizing cities, not repeating rules, but varying rules and situations. And there are four primary zones. Left, upper left is what we call a mountain island city. To the right is what we call the bridge city. Lower left is what we call the superblock city. And on the right is what we call the citadel city. So those are all zones within the 25 by 25 kilometer area. And each of those zones is distinct in terms of landform, water, and topography. And they're all connected with roads, they're all connected with monorails, they're all connected with trains. And in each case, this, for instance, and there are documents such as this for each portion of the city, and in each case, there are spatial design, architectural, form language suggestions for instance, how do you build on a hillside? And this is a cantilevered building over the site. And this is cut into the hill. And this portion is excavated from the hill. So there isn't a rule system. There are options and there are opportunities. And I'll show you a few of the sites very briefly. So this is the mountain island city. The site was a wetland. We enlarged the water area. So the mountain portion is this area. The island portion is obviously this. So this is the mountain island city. And you can see, and we're quite interested in not setting up a pro forma for each typology. So again, this is the excavated area. It's actually a concert hall, housing, which is cantilevered over the site, office and workspace, which is excavated into the site, and then this, which is a tram that connects you to the next site. This is the bridge city. Raises an important question which has to do with infrastructure. Infrastructure meaning hydraulic issues, power issues, transit issues, freeways, and so on. In this case, the objective was to integrate use and program with the infrastructure being, in this case, a bridge. So this is the bridge city. Photovoltaics on the towers. This is the superblock city. High density, over here please. High density at the center and then spreading out at lower density into the landscape. The superblock city and the citadel city, which is a university at the top of the hill, water at the bottom of the hill, water pumped up to the top of the hill during the day, gravity falls below during the night, essentially a hydraulic water-fed power system. The citadel city. The second aspect of the urban discussion has to do with an area on the west side of Los Angeles. This was an exhibition at the Museum of Contemporary Art in LA. And we call it Gnostic City. From time to time has to do with an architecture discussion that we began a number of years ago. A Gnostic being an individual with his or her own belief system, which is developed personally rather than collectively, not as a group point of view, not as an ideology, not as a collective stance, but in this case, architecture, one architect at a time. This is a conference center, small conference center in that complex of buildings. This is a building called The Box. It's really an essay on a topic that has been a point of discussion, the box, the meaning of the box. And I think our conclusion was that outside the box, there is often yet another box. This is an office building about 100 meters long, lifted in the air, creating a pedestrian route underneath. In the heart of what was an industrial and manufacturing area. Another building which raises again the issue of the transformation of form, about 120 meters in length, and I think also raises the topic of structure and construction. So this is a performance space. This area, this truss, is a proscenium defining that space. This is a rollback door for those performances. And part of the question is what you see and what you understand as an expression of the meaning of this long span, which is not so long really, it's about 20 meters. And you see portions of the truss, and then those pieces disappear within the structure. And there it is again, the staging area, the performance area. This is a project called the Art Tower, which works in two ways. It has a public aspect. It faces a train that runs by with a series of screens that send various messages. It also has an interior, a series of interior spaces that are provided potentially for exhibitions. And then it has a excavated theater area, seating area, you can see here, with a screen for lectures on a small scale. So to the outside, to the inside, and a lecture venue. And that's the face that confronts the train as it goes by. So this is a shape, an object. And this is a way of converting the shape, horizontal louvers, vertical louvers, introduction of additional louvers, and glazing. So the shape as an idea becomes a space as an idea, becomes a restaurant on 4 levels. So the restaurant, as the shape transforms itself, accommodates a lobby, a dining area, a kitchen, and a deck. It's called Vespertine. Adjacent to the restaurant, you can see if you look closely, the roof is open, it's a deck. You can do that in Southern California. And then the garden, which sequesters couples in twos, singly, twos, threes, fours, a bar, coffee, tea, building. And the garden, and from the street, the dining area, sequestered couple in the garden, dining adjacent to the fountain. This is another project in the area we've called the Pterodactyl, and it's really two projects. The first, built about 8 years earlier, is a 4-story garage. That was built, and then the structure was extended to accommodate an office building which drapes over the front of the garage at the point of the automobile entrance. These are ramps that take you up to the deck, which is the point. Oh, can I go backward? So you can see the garage and the office and the open deck areas that hang over the automobile entrance to the parking. The opposite elevation, which is facing east, in a courtyard. And the interior spaces, which were often called new work areas, they're very flexible spaces. They have games, they have food, mothers have their children, workers have pets, and so on. Very flexible, open, somewhat different type of office space, which is supposed to accommodate a digital age and a digital working process. This is a project that we did in the area for the LA Philharmonic. Green Umbrella Series was an experimental music series. And you can see here a more conventional concert space, a broken concert space with various seating accommodations, and in the exterior seating area, which is faced by the umbrella, which is a canopy and seats musician, glass canopy, bent glass canopy that accommodates members of the LA Philharmonic, about 20 in the seating area. That's the seating area, and from above, the umbrella. This is another investigation about glass and the meaning of glass, which always struck me as a kind of irony, that it's there, that it isn't, that it can support, but it doesn't, and it's transparent and translucent and opaque. And this discussion originated with a painting by the French artist Seurat, who painted very conservative subjects in a very radical way as a series of points. And again, the proposal here was for a canopy or roof as a series of trusses with steel tubes, with steel cables, and then the vertical members of the trusses are glass tubes in compression. So the irony, as I said, is this is glass as transparent, working structurally to support a roof. This was a drawing from a competition that we won at the Smithsonian Institute in Washington, D.C. This is a second project that uses the glass tube, glass in compression, glass as structure, glass as glass in compression, glass as transparent, glass as irony, in a project we're proposing in this site area. And for me, strikes us as a building with less form predilections, not quite formless, but with the emphasis on the interior space, which is roofed by the glass tubes that vary for acoustical reasons that cover the roof or the partial roof on the space. There's the interior space, performance area below, glass tubes above, and you can see here the the tubes, the cables, and then the tubes as vertical cords in a structural truss. And the beginning of the fabrication of the tubes, the original tubes in the Smithsonian were 3 meters in diameter. The tubes in this project are 2 feet, about 2/3 of a meter in diameter. The second portion of this area, this is a book that we produced a couple of years ago with Rizzoli called The New City. I'll see it when I believe it. And I think the title, aside from The New City, but I'll see it when I believe it, reverses a cliche in English, which is conventionally, I'll believe it when I see it. And what it suggests or what it implies is that the commitment and the conviction and the momentum moving a project in conception and drawing and construction is what makes it happen. It's not that it comes to happen outside of you, but that it comes to happen within you, within your goals and aspirations. You can make it so. This is the, wait a minute. So this is a site in Los Angeles, what's called the Los Angeles River, which is in fact encased in concrete, more a drainage area. And then a train that runs by the site. And the first of 3 projects here, this is 1, it's called the Wrapper. This is 2, it's called the Second Wrapper. And then the 3rd office building over here. All 3 in various stages of development currently. The history of these projects is certainly of interest to us. And the discussion began in the late 90s at an exhibition in the Wexner in the state of Ohio, which is in the American Middle West. And it was designed within a museum building that is essentially a study in grids and grid typologies. So what we introduced were a series of curving elements called the dancing bleachers. And then that exhibit materialized in an architectural way in 1999 as 2 tower projects. The inspiration for this is a poem that was written by the English poet William Butler Yeats in the 1930s, and it has to do with curvatures and turning, and a line in the poem which is, the center doesn't hold. And the curvatures that we introduced in opposition to the grid in Ohio then became the curvatures of the tower, which materialized again in 2020 as a structure for a single tower to be built in Los Angeles. And that discussion, that poetic discussion, begins with a series of concentric curves that are regulated and whole and cohere, and then begins to come apart and take the form which is less recognizable in terms of the original order. So the original order exists in a theoretical sense, but the physical manifestation of that gives only a clue, but never the conclusion to what started as a simple sequence of circles. So it's there, but it's not entirely legible, but underneath the aspiration, like the dancer to stability, which isn't quite recognized, and the sequence of curves, which is there, and is part of an order which is not entirely recognizable. So this is the project next to the Los Angeles River. This is the study model exiting, and the core on the left is pulled out of the building, so the floors are open and column free. This should be an animation. It now is. The building is placed on isolators. That's the design on the right. So in a conceptual sense, it's disconnected from the ground. And this is now a tool, particularly in seismic areas, for separating the ground in motion from the motion of the building, which makes the building more secure in an earthquake. So this is a kind of opera, a kind of Wagnerian opera, the beginning of the construction of the projects with hundreds of trucks and an enormous, what we call a mat foundation, and a variety of construction images of the project. The taller portion in the second image from the left is the core. The curving pieces, thanks to William Butler Yeats's poem, we call ribbons, the intersection of the ribbons which support the building. There are no columns. This is the first wrapper on the left, the second wrapper on the right, which is lifted in the air to facilitate pedestrian traffic, which comes from the train down the block, a conference center, a series of office spaces, and a roof deck. That's the second wrapper.
Set the spaces in the roof deck alarm for when?
Keep quiet, Siri. This is the this thing don't work. So this is an entry point, an exit from the second wrapper, an exit from the first wrapper, pedestrian traffic along the train right of way, and then an entry point for pedestrians into the site. The third project, which is now in a planning commission review in Los Angeles. This is perhaps the first COVID or post-COVID project that we've considered, and it has an enormous variety of spatial and organizational opportunities. This is really a production area with very long, deep, horizontal spaces adjacent to a lobby, then a theater zone, presentation zone, then a street in the sky here, 3 stories of public space in the air, then a variety of office sizes, shapes, spaces, and then a roof deck on the top. So a very versatile kind of spatial combination of parts. You see the model. And a partial worm's eye. You can see the 2 elevator cores and spaces stacked above. And then the condition and section, again, parking area below grade, the production horizontal spaces and lobby, the theater zones, the street in the sky, a variety of offices, and so on. I should say, and I didn't mention, that one particular point, this is the lobby space, an interesting point of the original tower, which is under construction. It's all office space, but the floor-to-floor heights, I neglected to mention, floor-to-floor heights vary. So they're 13.6, 16.6, 24 feet with a mezzanine. So a variety of office heights and spaces all office space, this project, the latest project in the COVID era, a variety of very different spatial organizational strategies and opportunities. This is one of the theater areas that looks out on the first wrapper. This is the street in the sky. It's a 3-story volume with offices on either side. Again, wrapper 1 and 2 and the third tower. You can see the landscape at the base of the third tower, which covers the ground plane and then climbs to enclose the first story of what we call the production area. This is a piece of a poem. You can see the first wrapper under construction and the mix of office heights. And it comes from a Roman author and suggests that one way or the other, we'll find a way, we all together, to do what we want to do, to build what we want to build, and make the future we anticipate and would like to make. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Eric. Now we are going to have some questions from the audience, and I will write, the audience will write their questions, and I will also, explain the questions to you. The first question is always very difficult, so I think I will start with the first question. You have done a great job converting Culver City from a declining warehouse district into a very interesting campus for creative-minded companies. That's how it is described. I wanted to ask you whether your approach could be different in times of this pandemic, because the pandemic has been changing not only our houses, the way we approach them, the way we fill them, but also public spaces. You know, now our houses are also our offices, our schools. They have gained a lot of different meanings, and also the public spaces have changed. How would you approach the same topic in terms of this very interesting pandemic, let's say, which is very confusing for everybody, not only architects?
So this is a good question and an obvious question and a question that everybody is asking. And we don't know the answer in a final sense. And I think I would argue generally we don't know any answers in final senses. But what we know is residential circumstances have obviously changed. Office working circumstances have obviously changed. And in fact, at least in this country, and I think in East Asia, there is less interest in office building in a conventional sense because the remote processes have to some extent been extremely successful. So the conversion of a house into an office or an apartment into an office seems to have reduced the interest in and the need for office space. The other side of that conversation that we've run into is that the longer this mess continues, the longer it continues, the more frustrating, at least on the part of some in the home, the more difficult the residential, office, educational situation is, the greater the aspiration and the desire and the need to get back out, to get back together with your coworkers, to get back together with your friends, and so on. So what I'm actually presenting is a contradiction, and I don't know yet how the contradiction will be resolved. Again, to repeat, one side of the equation is my house is now my office. I don't need to go to the office anymore. And the other side is I'm sick of my house being my office. I'm tired of that discussion. I'm disconnected from my coworkers and my friends, and I want to get out of here and get back on the street, get back in the city, get back in the theater, get back in the concert hall, and get back to my office. The other thing that seems to have happened with office work, which is worth considering in this discussion, and it's happened with us as well, is that governing purposes, goals, aspirations, hopes, developed over many years as people work and talk together, as we do that, are weakened by remote exchanges. And they are because the remote exchanges tend to be, at least many that I've seen, tend to be smaller and more project-specific focused. And the smaller they are, and the more project-specific focused they are, the more the overall goals of a company or endeavor or point of view are reduced and broken into fragments and pieces. And so what's driving us as we work on many different projects with many different obligations, but overall goals. And it's hard to keep those alive with a remote exchange with 30, 40, 50 people. It just doesn't work. So the strength of an organization and the power of an organization and the commitment of an organization, I found over time, is weakened by breaking the organization into small pieces, which seems to be necessary to process work remotely. So in that discussion, we don't know yet how it will go. It's conceivable that residential spaces are enlarged. They accommodate play as well as work. They accommodate exercising and the kinds of things that you would do outside. They accommodate educational issues with various screens and so on. So that may happen. The project I showed you, which is a current tower, which is under review in the city, is very different now because it anticipates not conventional office space. And the first wrapper, actually, for all its complexities, is essentially an office building with open plans at various heights, but nevertheless anticipated with a separated core in what has historically been a way to accommodate office space in the late 20th and early 21st centuries. The last building, what I call the post-COVID building or the current COVID building, suggests very, very different opportunities. It doesn't have residential in it, but that's an argument, and at some point that may be added. So when you're in a building where you reside, you don't necessarily accommodate all of the various work and educational activities within the residence, but you move to different pieces in the building to do different kinds of things. And of course, there are issues of access and proximity and hygiene and all of the issues that are proposed by medical and scientific types in order to make life doable and reasonably safe. So I think the tension between stay at home and work remotely and get back out and re-engage your contemporaries is a very interesting kind of argument. And we don't know yet how
Okay,
that will be
there is another
reconciled.
question. One of our audience asks, what is the most important turning point in your professional life?
Well, there's a trick answer to that, of course, because it's asked a lot. And the trick answer is always the next thing, because the implication, it's not altogether artificial, because it in its optimism, it anticipates that what happens next will be better, will improve, will be progressive, and that will advance on the goals that we aspire to. Although the goals themselves, as you just pointed out, are changing. I don't know that there's a particular moment when everything in terms of our goals and and our objectives formed. I think it's more a process of understanding what I said at the very beginning of the talk, and that was that architecture belongs to the world and it tells the world's story over millennium. And architecture also belongs to individuals, at least to a few individuals, architect by architect in a solitary way. And I think coming to an understanding that it could be about everything and touch everything, architecture can do that. And simultaneously, that it has an introverted side, that it can be very personal and private as one makes and remakes one's own world in architecture. And coming to that realization, I think, is the impetus for all the work that we've done
That was a
subsequently.
great answer, I think. I really liked it. Very political at the same time. Okay, so are there any other questions?
I mean, I can read a question here. It says the first thing you said at the beginning
Uh-huh.
of the presentation is to break the rules. As in architecture, we don't have rules, no limit, we may have boundaries. But what you did is you broke the rules of physics and construction. So my question is, how challenging was it, and how did you contribute the design to the structure?
Okay.
So somebody asked that. And of course, that's not correct. They're not the rules of physics. You can hang a building from a tree. You can dig a hole and bury a building. You can support it in multiple ways. And the investigation of those possibilities begins when you decide not to accept the conventional program or organizational or glazing or vertical circulation method that most builders use. So, of course, there are very conventional rules of order and living and space and use. They don't necessarily belong to physics, they belong to human purposes. So when you change those ideas, potentially, you change the human purposes. And when you change those, you have to invent or reimagine what makes that stand and not fall to the ground, or what encloses it so it doesn't rain in the building, or how you get up and down and how all of that new conception is used. But I would say again, from religious buildings to educational buildings to working situations in office buildings, there are very clearly international organizational ideas and standards. And when you confront those standards, when you take those standards on, you challenge ways of living and working and building. And you have to challenge all of those and then make a case that a different way of seeing and thinking and working is a plausible opportunity for a client to build
We
what the
have two
client
more
wants to build.
questions. One is one of the main concerns we are facing nowadays is climate change. What, in your opinion, is the best way to fight said problem, and how can we normalize a more conscious way of designing not only in architecture but also in urban planning?
Well, I would say, from an American point of view, sadly, the first issue is to acknowledge that this is an issue, because it is, and a substantial issue, and it is. And once you do that, and I'll give you some examples. In South Korea, we were involved in some discussions regarding the connection of the Han and the Nakdong rivers to make an urban waterway that essentially would allow you to sail from Japan to China. And it had any number of environmental positives to do it. But in order to do it,
Yes, we do. Mm-hmm.
can you hear me? Okay, so the video is shut down, but as long as
Okay.
you can hear me, I'll finish the discussion. So what was interesting with the two rivers, there was an enormous initial commitment in the billions and billions of dollars in order to make that excavation to connect the rivers. So I think what we need is agreements in the first place on long-term environmental priorities. And this goes from simple issues like photovoltaics to rising tides on the coasts of every piece of land on the earth. And if we can get a shared political commitment on that, we'll get a shared budgetary commitment. And if we get a shared budgetary commitment, then we will include in our repertoire as a high priority dealing with these questions. It's not a question of imagination at the level of architecture and city planning, although parenthetically there may be a push, don't build on mountainsides, don't build in coastal zones. I'm not sure about those issues. There's certainly a lot of very interesting work potentially as remediation of coastal zones in places like Miami and Florida and Los Angeles and New York and Seattle and so on, areas that belong to the water. I mean, the quintessential example of that is keeping the Adriatic Sea out of Venezia, which we're all familiar with. So I think what we have to do is to gather together collectively and commit to this issue. Not just individuals, but governments, big governments, the American government, the EU government, East Asian governments, the Turkish government. In a collective way, I think it has to be, and this is very much involved in international work anyway, sharing of ideas, sharing of goals, sharing of budgets. We can do it. We have to do it. We will
There
do
was a
it.
question which
It's a
I think
primary goal.
omitted but I would like, this is an interesting one, so I wanted to go back to it. Mr. Bitterman is asking, when you commit to the shape of the building in the early design stage, when the program is not yet on the agenda? What criteria do you apply? Yeah.
Well, it's an interesting question, and I think it's a good question because what I said in the discussion, what I mentioned is that we should acknowledge that there is an assumption, an old assumption, and an out of date assumption that the form of the building is related to the use of the building, that the form and function of a building are corollary. And I think our premise, and I think I said this, is we can fit anything into anything. Now, that's a caricature. I mean, that's not literally true, but it's part of the conception. So we could make a spatial organization like the Dolly City Event Center, and that the making of that shape anticipated a couple of things. One is that it's on the edge of a cliff looking over a lake, and we would need to have decks and windows and open spaces that would allow the people in the building to take advantage of that. The second thing is there were two enormous horizontal zones. We knew that. One was an exhibition area, one was a lecture and conference area. So we knew that. And we also knew that because of everything we had to move up and down, not only people, exhibitions and so on and so on, that there would be a substantial vertical organizational circulation movement component. We also knew that the site, which is a beautiful site and a rolling landscape, would be terraced and would involve some kind of outdoor discourse and presentation area. So in the spatial diagram, which is none of those specifics, all of those aspects that we anticipated in the program could be foreseen, not literally, but organizationally. So what we were making was a kind of conceptual, spatial, organizational strategy from which or into which the specifics of the program were fit and refit until the shape, the form, the space, and the use all
Okay. Now,
coalesced and worked together.
Ms. Sanlı is asking, I got architectural education as form follows function. When I graduated, I saw your book in 1991 with the preface of Philip Johnson. I was astonished with geometry's overlap, stability, instability, tension. I couldn't believe my eyes in those years. How did you choose this route as challenging and as radical as this kinetic architecture so many years ago? So we have good questions.
Thank you. Thank you for the question. I think again I would say to the lady who asked the question that so much of this depends on how an individual understands her role or his role in a culture. And there was somebody a few moments ago who said there weren't any rules. So this couldn't be more incorrect. There are all sorts of rules and admonitions with behavior, with demeanor, and those extend to design and building, and in fact, the education, and she references the education of designers and builders. But what happens at a certain moment from time to time is new ideas work their way, begin to suggest there's a place for something different. There's another way to see the world and to think about what it might be. And this could be in any area. It could be in economics, it could be in sociology, it could be in painting, and it could be in architecture. that what's being done and what's being taught is not the whole story. It's never the whole story. And you can look backwards and you can see that, because in fact there are changes. And the question is, what is your role relative to accepting what you're taught, form and function? And what is your role in terms of saying to the teacher, wait a minute, you left something out. There's something I see or something I feel. So if somebody listens to Beethoven or Mozart, and then Mahler comes along, or Bartok comes along, or John Cage comes along, or for instance, somebody reads a conventional book, capital letter, noun, verb, period, conventional sentence structure, and then along comes somebody like Faulkner or E.E. Cummings or James Joyce and says, wait a minute, that's not the only way to write a sentence. That's not the only way to communicate an idea. I mean, I mentioned very briefly the Seurat painting with the glass tubes. This is the way you paint. See this? This is a brush. This is a color. This is a stroke. This is a line. No, it isn't. Seurat said, you know what you do to make a surface?
Mhm.
You use little points, dots. So now a surface is points. It's dots. And Seurat said that. Whether anybody listened to him and continued to do that is one thing. Sometimes an exception is an exception. It's only an exception. It begins, it has a role, and it goes away. And sometimes an exception changes the discussion, makes it a different discussion. And for me, in a personal sense, what I was interested in was not what I was told, but as I said, what I wasn't told, what was left out of the conversation. And could I add to the conversation, and could I change the conversation? Why exactly I took that role on is a more complicated psychotherapeutic question. But people take that role on. Sometimes it works. It's worked for us. Sometimes it doesn't. It hasn't worked for us. So there are examples in many directions. But what was never conceded was that we wouldn't do that. So we decided very early we would always do that. What's missing? What's left out? What could we see or imagine or reimagine that was different? And I mean, there are certainly obvious examples. I mentioned Joyce as a writer, or Cage as a composer. And so though Gaudí is certainly a kind of quizzical, unique voice in the history of architecture. So those are part of the story too. So when you tell the story, the exceptions matter as much as the rules, and on occasion, the exceptions change the rules. Then there are new rules. Then we need you to come along and make another exception.
Eric,
And that's the way
it
it
has
works.
been a long day for you during this presentation, but we have two last questions. I'm not going to take any more. Students and architects keep writing, but I don't want to extend it anymore. Two last questions. Again, a lady, one of our former graduates, she's asking, I'm very inspired by your design list. I clearly understand that they are pure architecture, as you have said. So my question here would be about how you turn them into a building when you have the landscape and other conditions. You explained it one of your projects, but I would love to hear your other comments about them.
I think that, here's what I would say, that in general terms, to the lady, you have to be able to hold contradictory ideas and different points of view in your head simultaneously at the same time. So if you're making a lawn and somebody has to put a lawnmower on it, or the grass will become a jungle, so you can't make a lawn that can't be mowed, or you have to find a new lawnmower that can mow lawns on vertical or diagonal plane. The point is, you don't want to give in to the organizational or spatial conventions that belong to history. So then you have to say you have to learn history and you have to hate it at the same time. Or you have to learn history and you have to be willing to put it aside. Or you have to listen to a conventional argument from a client or a planning commission or a building department or a co-worker, and understand it. In other words, you have to stand in the place of the person who is saying it, and then you have to realize that that position isn't adequate. It's not sufficient, but it's not entirely irrelevant. And one of the reasons I showed the ballerina in the Balanchine performance, and it probably would have been better to freeze it at a certain moment, is the guy's on the ground, his hands in the air, she's on one toe or whatever it is, reaching down, and their hands are shaking. So if you do architecture the way I'm describing it, your hands will shake. And if your hands are shaking, you know you got it right.
Great. Okay, now
That's
I
my
think
answer.
the last question, because there are more, but I will quit after this one. This is asked by a student. I think it would be nice to stop with this one, to end with this one. She says, it was such a nice and mind-opening conference, sir. As an architecture student, the challenge for us to start the design. My question is, in which step do you start your design? In the beginning of your presentation, just 1 second, still people are asking, so it's moving down. Okay. In the beginning of your presentation, you showed us some model-like videos. My question is, should we shape the structure for a form? The second video, it was really interesting, you know, the models, the different forms.
Yes. Can you what's the question?
My question is, should we shape the structure for a form?
Do I make a structure or do I make a form?
Maybe.
I guess
I guess to have this conversation, and this is the difficulty with some of these kinds of discussions. When you say structure, what do you mean? When you say form, what do you mean? In a conventional answer, a building structure, as a part of an architecture curriculum, means what holds it up so it doesn't fall down. Structure could have a different conception. It could have a more organizational, strategic conception. The form of the building, a synonym for that might be the shape of the building or the space the building makes. But so I don't want to get lost in all the words, but I would say things like form and shape and space are different than structure. So let's use structure as what holds it up or what keeps it from falling down. Okay? And the form and the shape and the space may have nothing to do, could be a completely separate discussion. For instance, in the Vespertine project, what I showed you, that's the restaurant project, okay? So in the restaurant project, I started and I said, this is a shape. It was actually a solid, and I made it from a pad, a stack of pads of paper, and essentially adjusted it and twisted it and so on. That's a shape. That doesn't tell you the structure. That shape could be a solid. It could be held up on 4 walls. That shape could be held up with a column in the center, cantilevering to the perimeter and holding up the perimeter from the center. That could be the structure. The structure could follow the shape, mirror it, repeat it, copy it. The structure could precede the shape, make a structural shape and copy that. Office towers, conventional office towers often do that. So they make a line of columns, they make a line of beams, they throw in the glass, and the shape and the form and the space coincide with the structure. The way we work, they're 2 different subjects, and sometimes they coincide with one another and repeat one another. And sometimes they're quite different and separate. And for instance, I mentioned the Vespertine structure, which is itself a series of vertical and horizontal planes of steel and infill with glass. Inside of that, in each corner, there's a column. The shape of the outside is a curve made of straight lines. The shape of the column, which is a pipe, which is round, is not a curve in section, but it's a sequence of straight lines which are analogous to, but not identical with, the shape of the exterior. So there's a relationship in that building between an interior column and beam system and an exterior shape. But there doesn't have to be. And so I would say to the lady who asked the question, that's the point. That's the point. In other words, we don't have to follow a regulation which says the structure and the space and the shape must coincide. They're 2 different topics with 2 different purposes, and sometimes they dovetail and coincide, and sometimes they do not. And we'll make that decision project by project.
There are, of course, more questions, but I think we can stop here. If you want to go on, we are ready to hear your answers, but I think you might be tired. I can't hear you. Michael is asking, is Michael your student? Michael Bitterman? He's writing. Okay, I'll read his last question. No, I'm not his student. Why did you put an old-timer car into the ballerina Quarterback building rendering? Is that an intentional reference to the photograph of Corbusier's Wiesenhof building in the 1920s?
It's not the Wiesenhof, I don't think. I think it's the Ministry of Education in Rio de Janeiro. So Le Corbusier in that era, which must have been the 1930s or 40s, put an automobile in front of the building in order to make his argument, which I certainly do not agree with, although I'm sympathetic to the argument at the time it was made. It's now a different time, so we need to not make that argument anymore. So I think it's not the Wiesenhof. The Wiesenhof, which is a collection of lots of interesting houses in Stuttgart, And then after Le Corbusier did that, in that famous photograph, Jim Sterling in the Leicester Engineering Building, I think in the 1970s or something, did the same thing and put the old-fashioned car under the cantilever canopy. Well, it's not cantilever, it's propped up, but anyway, of the engineering building, which is a very exceptional and incredibly thoughtful building, I have to say. And knowing that history and the interest in it, and at this point, I think it's an irony. It's not an advocacy. So Bitterman is, tell Bitterman if he's listening to look up the Leicester Engineering Building with Jim Sterling, and then the Ministry of Education in Rio. I think that's where Le Corbusier put it first off. And I didn't know that it was a Mercedes-Benz, which doesn't matter very much to me. But I think what I'm interested, but what I can say is it wasn't so much the idea of the car related to engineering. Don't forget, Le Corbusier was the guy who said, look, they make cars that way. Let's make houses that way. Trying to correlate the technical and engineering process of making an automobile with the technical and engineering process of making a house, and then the educational building. And I don't find that convincing, but I can understand in an intellectual way why it had a point to be made at the time. I also don't think, and I see Mr. Bitterman is talking about style, and I think that would likely offend Le Corbusier, that he was a fashionista or stylist. I think he was looking for something deeper. I think the implication of the car is not style, it's technique and technology and science, which was supposed to lead the way in architecture. You can argue about that. I don't think it did. And you people and I are part of that history. We're part of that chronology. We're adding to it in a different time. And I think the putting of the car there was a recognition of that chronology. You're part of that. I'm part of that. We're all part of that. And I recognize it and I appreciate it. Although I don't agree with the original argument, that wasn't the point. The point was a recognition, as far as I know, from Le Corbusier to Jim Sterling to now, to us, that exchange exists, that you hand one from one to the next across time. And that's why I did it, and that's why
Mr. Bitterman has remarked that Kovu was a painter, but he also remarked that a house is a machine for living in. So he was defining the house as a machine.
Interesting question. Thank you for the question. Yeah, but of course, yes, that's an argument. Make cars, make houses, there's an analogy. I think when you look at the work doesn't necessarily confirm that argument. But it's an argument, and he wasn't the only person to make it. A lot of people, I mean, there's a famous Russian architect, Moses Ginsburg, who made that argument. A lot of Santelia, futurists, constructivists, all of those people shared a huge optimism in the capacity of technology and assembly lines and machines to make a new world of architecture. And it did, and it didn't.
Thank you, but very
I
interesting question.
Yeah, I think it was a very interesting
It's a very
question.
interesting
Thanks for
question.
your contribution, Mr. Bitterman. And Eric, I don't know how to thank you. It was really so enlightening, so rich, so motivating, not for our students only, but for all of us. I hope we will meet you face to face in the near future. As you said, we are tired of living like this in our, separately, away from each other during the pandemic era. And thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation. Thank you for the questions, and I look forward to seeing you
Soon.
next
Yes,
to the
we hope so too.
phosphorus
Okay,
very soon.
have a good day, and I would like to thank Eric also for Eric McNevin for helping us through this process. Yeah, he did a lot of work with us. Thank
Yes,
you.
he did a lot of work. Yes,
Okay, bye bye.
thank you.